Encyclopedia Brown. Everyone's favorite boy detective and the case of the midnight visitor. By Donald J. Sobel. 1. The case of the midnight visitor. Now there are some people in the United States who had never heard of Idyllwill. But they were not policemen. Every policeman from Maine to California knew about Idyllwill. Anyone who broke the law there was caught. Not a crook escaped. How could that be? What was the secret? No one ever guessed. Idyllwill looked like many other seaside towns its size. It had lovely beaches, 3 movie theaters, and 4 banks. It had churches, a synagogue, and 2 delicatessens. And on Rover Avenue it had a certain red brick house. In the house lived Idyllwill's secret weapon against crime, 10-year-old Encyclopedia Brown. Encyclopedia's father was chief of police. Because no one got away with breaking the law, the people of Idyllwill thought he was the bravest and smartest police chief in the world. True, Chief Brown was brave. And he was smart enough to know what to do with a case he could not solve. He took it home to dinner. Over soup, he told his son the facts. Encyclopedia usually figured out the answer before dessert. Chief Brown hated keeping the help he got from his only child a secret. He wanted Encyclopedia's sneakers hung in the Crime Fighters Hall of Fame. But what good would it do to suggest it? Who would take him seriously? Who would believe that the mastermind behind Idyllwill's spotless police record was a 5th grader? So Chief Brown said nothing. Encyclopedia never mentioned the help he gave his father. He didn't want to seem different from other boys. There was nothing he could do about his nickname, however. Only his parents and teachers called him by his real name, Leroy. Everyone else called him Encyclopedia. An encyclopedia is a book or set of books filled with facts from A to Z. So was Encyclopedia's head. He had read so many books his pals swore his ears were turning into bookends. Monday evening Chief Brown sipped his soup slowly. Encyclopedia and his mother knew what that meant. He had his mind on a case. Finally, Mrs. Brown said, "Why don't you tell Leroy about it, dear?" Chief Brown sighed. "I don't know. This is an awfully tough case," he said. "It has me beaten. Leroy has never failed you." "Tell him," urged Mrs. Brown. "Very well," said Chief Brown. C.T. Butler was kidnapped from his home last night. Mrs. Brown gasped. Encyclopedia let out a low whistle. C.T. Butler was a millionaire. He owned a string of pizza parlors in 3 states and a big house by the ocean. "Today at noon, Mrs. Butler received a phone call," said Chief Brown. A man's voice said that her husband was unharmed, but he was being held for $500,000 ransom. The caller told Mrs. Butler to remain home tomorrow, at which time she would be told by phone where to leave the money. "You hope to capture the kidnappers before they are paid the ransom, Dad?" said Encyclopedia. "We must," replied Chief Brown grimly. "Kidnappers want money. Once they get it, there is no telling what they might do to their victim." "Poor Mr. Butler," exclaimed Mrs. Brown. "Well, at least you have until tomorrow to find him." "That's too little time," said Chief Brown. "Somebody must have heard or seen something," said Encyclopedia. "Mrs. Butler was of some help," said Chief Brown. "From what she told me, it's possible to fit together a few pieces." He took a spoonful of soup. Then he related all that the police had been able to learn about the kidnapping. Last night, Mr. and Mrs. Butler were in bed watching a late movie on television. A little after midnight, the front doorbell rang. Mr. Butler went downstairs to see who it was. Mrs. Butler turned off the television and listened. She heard him talking to someone she thinks a man. She couldn't make out the words, but the tone was friendly. Then she heard the sounds of the door closing and footsteps going into the den. Mr. Butler and his visitor lowered their voices. She could scarcely hear them at all. She went to sleep. She was awakened by the closing of the front door and then went back to sleep. When she awoke this morning, Mr. Butler wasn't in the house. The front door was closed but unlocked. "Wasn't Mrs. Butler worried?" asked Mrs. Brown. "No," answered Chief Brown. She thought her husband had dressed quietly so he wouldn't wake her and had gone to the office. He sometimes forgets to lock the front door behind him. She didn't report him missing until she got the phone call from the kidnapper. "Wasn't she worried when he didn't return to bed after the visitor left?" said Mrs. Brown. Chief Brown shook his head. "Mr. Butler often gets up at night to work in his den." She thought he had simply remained downstairs to go over some business. "You don't have much to work with, dear," said Mrs. Brown. "We know that whoever came to the door wasn't a stranger," said Chief Brown. "Mr. Butler never would have let a stranger into his house late at night. I think this is what happened." The visitor spoke with Mr. Butler in the den. Then he opened the window and made Mr. Butler climb into the backyard, where other men were waiting. They forced Mr. Butler into a car on the dark street and drove away. The visitor left by the front door. "Wasn't that dangerous?" said Mrs. Brown. "Someone might have seen him under the night light. He was probably afraid that he'd been seen entering the house. So he had to be seen leaving. He was prepared to say that Mr. Butler was still in the house when he left. But no one saw him enter or leave." "Then you really have no clues," said Mrs. Brown glumly. "Only a calendar," replied Chief Brown. He got up from the table and returned with his briefcase. He took out a calendar. On it was handwritten in pencil, 789-1011. Mrs. Butler had been in the den last night with her husband just before they went upstairs to the bedroom, said Chief Brown. She said nothing was different on his desk this morning but the writing on the calendar. "That is, this number." Chief Brown passed the calendar to Encyclopedia. "Make anything out of it, son?" he inquired. Encyclopedia studied the number and the calendar. He closed his eyes. He always closed his eyes when he did his hardest thinking. 7891011. "Does Mr. Butler have any enemies?" asked Mrs. Brown. "Every wealthy man has enemies," said Chief Brown. "He is known to have argued with Arthur Jason, John McNear, and Matt Short. There are probably a dozen others." "I argue with my closest friends," objected Mrs. Brown, "and I haven't been kidnapped." Encyclopedia opened his eyes. He asked his one question. He seldom needed more than one question to break a case that his father brought home to dinner. "Was there any paper on Mr. Butler's desk?" "Just a small pad by the telephone," said Chief Brown. "But it was blank." "Is that a clue, Leroy?" said Mrs. Brown anxiously. "Yes," said Encyclopedia. When the visitor went to open the window, Mr. Butler seized the moment to write this number on the calendar. "What does it mean?" asked Mrs. Brown. "It tells us the visitor's name," said Encyclopedia. "The rest should be easy, right, Dad?" "What was the visitor's name?" "To the Case of the Hidden Penny." Encyclopedia wanted to help the children of the neighborhood. So when school let out for the summer, he opened his own detective agency in the garage. Every morning he hung out his sign. On Tuesday, business was slow all morning till Elmo Thomas came in. Elmo was Idavil's junior yo-yo champion. "Mothers," he grumbled. "They don't understand kids." "That's no way to talk," protested Encyclopedia. If my mother understood me, I wouldn't have got kicked in the rear and had my best yo-yo stolen. I'd be worth a lot of money, besides. All that is your mother's fault? Well, not really, admitted Elmo. She just doesn't understand what it takes to be a yo-yo champ. You can't sit back. You have to keep your hand and eye sharp to stay in the big time. You follow me? Keep talking, and maybe I'll catch up, said Encyclopedia. Last week I broke a lamp in the living room doing a loop-the-loop, said Elmo. This morning I was in the kitchen practicing round the corner when Mom tripped over the string. Her breakfast went flying. She said something to you, guessed Encyclopedia. And how? She told me I'd have to practice outdoors. That was mean. It's daylight outdoors. You noticed, said Encyclopedia, blink ing. I'd planned to work today in the basement with my #1 yo-yo. It glows in the dark, said Elmo. But I made the best of things. I went outside and put a blanket over my head. Encyclopedia could scarcely wait to hear what was coming next. I was getting pretty good under the blanket, said Elmo. No fancy stuff like 3-leaf clover or man on the flying trapeze. Just lots of fast sizz thwop. Till Bugs Meany kicked my backside. Oh, boy, said Encyclopedia. Bugs shows up wherever there is trouble. Bugs Meany was the leader of a gang of tough older boys. They called themselves the Tigers. They should have called themselves the Taffy Twisters. They were always pulling something crooked. After Bugs kicked me, he yanked off the blanket and begged my pardon, recalled Elmo. He said he thought I was an Arab. He took my yo-yo and put it in his pocket and asked me my name. Elmo Thomas, I said. Bugs laughed. Go buy yourself a last name, he said, and flipped me a penny. He bought your best yo-yo for 1 cent, exclaimed Encyclopedia. No wonder you're sore. Forget the yo-yo, said Elmo. The penny was dated 1908 and had an S mark under the date. It's worth $25 or more. Bugs must have seen the look on my face right away. He took back the penny and kept the yo-yo. Elmo put a quarter on the gas can beside Encyclopedia. I want to hire you, he said. Get back the penny. I figure it belongs to me. So do I, said Encyclopedia. If I know Bugs, he'll have hidden the yo-yo, but he won't let the penny out of his sight. Come on. The two boys hurried to the Tigers' clubhouse, an unused tool shed behind Mr. Sweeney's auto body shop. The clubhouse was empty. When Bugs celebrates a crooked deal, he usually goes to Friedman's Delicatessen for a hot dog and root beer, Encyclopedia said. The sauerkraut is free. He's probably there now. Encyclopedia was correct. Bugs stood at the relish counter. He had piled sauerkraut 2 inches high on his hot dog and roll and was smearing mustard on top with a wooden spoon. Make like a rattlesnake and bite yourself to death, he growled as the boy detective came up. Encyclopedia was used to Bugs' warm greeting. You stole the penny you paid Elmo for his yo-yo this morning. Give it back. Elmo? Who's Elmo? Gasped Bugs, looking around. Me, you big bully, said Elmo. Man, oh, man, cried Bugs. I never saw this child in my life. I was out in the woods all morning studying woodpeckers to find out why they don't get headaches. He walked toward a table and sat down. Encyclopedia and Elmo followed. Bugs leaned over and tightened the lace on his right shoe. He bit into his hot dog and chewed, his mouth barely able to close. Then he took a drink of root beer. Go on, Scram, he said. I'm eating. He shifted under Encyclopedia's stare and tapped his right foot nervously. Say, maybe you'd like to search me? Nope, said Encyclopedia. Bugs shrugged and finished his drink. He tossed the paper cup into a trash can 10 feet away. I'm going for another soda, he announced. Be useful and watch my hot dog while I'm gone. He walked toward the soda counter grinning. Why didn't you search him? Demanded Elmo. Because I know where he's hidden the penny, replied Encyclopedia. Where? 3. The case of the red sweater. Bugs meanie lived for the day when he could get even with Encyclopedia. Bugs hated being outsmarted all the time. He longed to smack Encyclopedia so hard the boy detective would have to stand on his head to turn things over in his mind. But Bugs never dared throw a punch. Whenever he felt like it, he thought of Sally Kimball. Sally was Encyclopedia's partner and the prettiest girl in the 5th grade. More to the point, she had done what no boy under 12 had believed possible. She had punched out Bugs' meanie. Whenever they fought, Bugs ended on the ground mumbling about a low bridge. Because of Sally, Bugs never tried to bully Encyclopedia. But he never stopped planning his day of revenge. Bugs hates you as much as me, Encyclopedia said to Sally. He'll never live down the lickings you gave him. The two detectives were sitting in the Brown Detective Agency playing checkers. It was a chilly morning. Sally wore a gray sweatshirt and Encyclopedia his red sweater. Suddenly a girl in a black leather jacket appeared at the door. She was holding a human skull. The skull had 2 holes in the top. Bullet holes, said the girl. I just know it. Encyclopedia studied the holes and shook his head. The science department at the high school got a new skeleton last year and threw away the old one, he said. The skull had 2 holes in the top where it was hung by wire. Where did you find it? Asked Sally. In the junkyard an hour ago, answered the girl. The rest of the skeleton is there. Encyclopedia had been eager to own a skeleton for some time. He asked the girl to take them to the spot. During the bike ride, he learned that her name was Carmine Oldfield and that she was new in the neighborhood. I heard you were detectives, she said. I thought I'd better bring the skull straight to you. When they arrived at the junkyard, Carmine went to the back gate. The lock was broken. See that oil drum by the yellow truck? She asked. The rest of the skeleton is in there. The detectives hurried to the oil drum. Inside was a thick sack. Encyclopedia reached down and pulled it out. Caught in the act. Bugs meanie leaped from behind a pile of wrecked cars. Officer Murphy was at his heels. Let me have the sack, said Officer Murphy sharply. Encyclopedia handed it to the policeman, who opened it upon the ground. Instead of bones, the sack held pens, wallets, toy cars, and other small articles. Man, oh, man, sang Bugs. I broke Idavil's biggest shoplifting ring. Bugs claims you've been shoplifting at the 5 and Dime for months, explained Officer Murphy. On the way back from town, you hide your loot here. He's been tailing you. When did we shoplift? Demanded Sally. Tell me. Bugs named days. They were the days the detectives had biked into town during the past month. Nice try, Bugs, said Encyclopedia. But we have a witness, Carmine Oldfield. Carmine. Carmine was nowhere in sight. You put her up to this, Bugs meanie, cried Sally. You're so crooked you have to screw on your socks. Bugs sniffed. Kindly tell them, officer. Officer Murphy spoke to Encyclopedia. Bugs stopped me this morning as I was driving past the junkyard on my rounds. He said he saw a boy in a red sweater leaning over the oil drum. Bugs knows I have only one sweater, this red one, said Encyclopedia. This is a trick to get even. Mr. Dillon, who owns the yard, saw a boy leaning into the barrel at about the same time, said Officer Murphy. However, he couldn't make out more than the red sweater because of the distance. The boy was Bugs in a red sweater pretending to be Encyclopedia, said Sally. Then Bugs changed to the brown one he has on now before stopping you, officer. This dame is off the wall, said Bugs. If I changed sweaters, the red one would still be around here. I didn't have time to go home. So why are you wearing a girl's brown sweater, said Sally. The buttons are on the left side. A boy's sweater has the buttons on the right side. Bugs looked like a boy who had swallowed a school of goldfish. Finally he stammered. It's my girlfriend's sweater. I borrowed it this morning. What girlfriend? Jeered Sally. On a date, you throw money around like a man in a straitjacket. Bugs snarled. Sally snarled back. Officer Murphy had to step between them. Encyclopedia glanced down at his own red sweater. It had stains where he had leaned against the oil drum. The stains on Bugs' sweater were different. Officer Murphy said, Mr. Dillon didn't see a girl, but Bugs says he saw you, Sally. Bugs claims you two spoke about coming back in an hour to change the hiding place. So I agreed to wait with him and watch. Bugs clapped his head. The son of our beloved chief of police is a cheap shoplifter, he cried. Oh, the shame of it! Sally was shaking with anger. Encyclopedia, you can't let Bugs get away with this. Don't worry, said Encyclopedia. He won't. Why not? For the case of the painting Gerbils. On the day the summer art show opened, Mark Reardon trotted into the Brown Detective Agency. He was alone. Immediately Encyclopedia smelled trouble. Mark seldom went any place without Herman and Sherman, his gerbils. Mark's father ran a training school for pets and always said, I never met a problem gerbil. But Encyclopedia guessed that the gerbils had a problem. Is Herman hurt? He inquired. Or Sherman? Just their pride, replied Mark. They've been insulted. Somebody told on them. Told what? Asked Sally. That they're gerbils, said Mark. Nobody would mistake them for kangaroos, remarked Encyclopedia. I mean, don't they like being gerbils? Yes, but they want to be artists, too, said Mark. Read this. He handed Encyclopedia a newspaper story. It told about a Texas chimpanzee named Manfred Simpson. Manfred was allowed to throw fruit against a sheet of wood. After a month, the wood was caked with goo. His owner had called the mess Earth Mother and had entered it in an art show in Chicago. Earth Mother won first prize. Before the world discovered it was done by an ape, the painting was bought for $15,000 by a museum in New York. I get it, said Encyclopedia. What a chimp can do, two gerbils can do. You better believe it, said Mark. But somebody told the judges at the art show this morning that Herman Sherman is really two gerbils. The judges wouldn't accept their painting. Who told? Asked Sally. I'm sure it was either Farnsworth Grant or Jerry Tilson or Scott Wells, said Mark. They were the only ones besides me and my folks who knew what Herman and Sherman can do. Mark laid 25 cents on the gas can by Encyclopedia. I want to hire you to find out which one is the dirty snitch, he said. All three are my pals or were. 2 days ago they played over at my house. One of them must have stolen a peek at Herman and Sherman's painting. The detectives went with Mark to his house. Encyclopedia wanted to look at the Gerbils' workshop. Mark led them through the kitchen and into the garage. On the floor was a large piece of plywood covered with many colors. One corner was cut off. "It's really pretty good for modern art," said Encyclopedia in surprise. "My dad said most of it is too good," replied Mark. "He said that if the judges thought it was beautiful or looked like something, the Gerbils wouldn't win a prize. So he sawed off the worst part and entered that in the show." "Your dad knows the secret of modern art," said Encyclopedia. "I don't understand how the Gerbils do it," said Sally. "You might say they finger paint it," answered Mark. "I spill cans of different colors on the wood. Then Herman and Sherman slide their paws around. It's their hobby." "Cleaning them afterward must be hard," said Sally. "Nah, the paint has a water base," said Mark. "All I do is squirt them with an electric water pick." "You suspect Farnsworth Grant or Jerry Tilson or Scott Wells of telling on them?" said Encyclopedia. "Why?" "All three knew Herman and Sherman are artists," said Mark. He explained that the day before yesterday, the four boys had been together in his sunroom. "Farnsworth and I played ping pong," he said. "Scott watched television. Jerry read." Suddenly Jerry asked what misled meant. We all thought it was the past tense of mile. Jerry went into the kitchen and looked up the word in the dictionary that Mom keeps by her cookbooks and shouted back the meaning. "Jerry could have opened the door to the garage and peeked at the Gerbils painting," said Sally. "And so could have Scott and Farnsworth," said Mark. Farnsworth banged his wrist on the edge of the ping-pong table. It was just a scratch, but he ran into the kitchen to use the first aid kit.